Potstickers! That's right, I love all sorts of dumplings, but these are probably my favorite, and perfect for people that can't decide whether they want fried dumplings or steamed dumplings, since these are fried and steamed, and then actually fried again. And don't even get me started on the amazingly flavorful, easy to make pork filling, which is exactly what we're going to get started with. And we'll begin with 1 pound of freshly ground pork, to which we'll add some finely minced garlic, as well as some sliced green onions. And this time we can use the light and the green parts. And then we're also going to want lots of very finely chopped ginger. And I know we usually grate that on the microplane, but this time I want you to take a knife and chop it up until it's nice and fine like you see here. But anyway, we'll continue on by adding some soy sauce, as well as a little touch of sesame oil, which we always want to be careful of since that really can overpower things. And then of course it never hurts to put in a nice shake of cayenne. And then last but not least, we're going to add a whole bunch of finely chopped up green cabbage. Or at least that's what I used. You could probably use any kind you want. Savoy, Napa, even the red cabbage, which is really purple. So that's up to you. You are, after all, the binging with Babish of your cabbage. And then once all that's in there, we'll take a fork and mix this until combined. And yes, we could use our hands, but whenever we're mixing meat, we want to be careful not to overwork it. Okay, I want a nice tender filling in these pot stickers, and not a tough rubbery meatball. So I find with this method there's a little less mashing of the meat, and also we don't have the heat from our hands warming the fat. So we'll go ahead and fork this mixture and fork it good, until we're sure everything's thoroughly combined. At which point we'll clean up the sides and sort of pat it down. And then what we'll do is wrap this in plastic and transfer it into the fridge while we make our dough. And not only is this stuff easier to work with cold, it will also give it time for all those flavors to sort of mingle together. You know, just like a party's not that great when everyone first gets there. Same idea. So we'll pop that in the fridge and start our very, very simple dough. And all we're going to need for that is a couple cups of all-purpose flour, to which we'll add a little bit of salt, and then last but not least, some hot water. Okay, it doesn't have to be boiling. You can just use hot tap water, or just microwave some till it's hot. Then we'll go ahead and pour that in and give it a stir with a wooden spoon. And we'll keep stirring until it forms what we call in the business a shaggy dough. Which I don't know why, but is really fun to say. Shaggy dough. So we'll go ahead and mix that until it looks like this. At which point we'll flour our hand and transfer that onto a work surface. And then all we have to do is knead this until it comes together into a smooth, elastic ball of dough. And when we do things like this, once out of every 1,000 times, we'll have the perfect amount of flour and water. But almost always we have to adjust, usually with more flour. So if we feel it's a little sticky, we'll stop and sprinkle a little more on. And we'll continue kneading, adding more if necessary, until we have, as I said earlier, a fairly smooth, fairly elastic dough. Which is going to take, 3, 4, 5 minutes. I guess it depends on how furious you need. But when you're done, it'll look something like this, and sort of spring back to the touch. And then what we'll do once we've reached that point, or you just got tired of kneading and decided to stop, is we will wrap that in plastic and let it sit out just like that for 30 minutes. And you'll see when you come back to unwrap it, it's going to be even smoother and more silky, and just an absolute pleasure to work with. So 30 minutes later we'll unwrap and proceed to divide it into 4 sections, which I'm just going to do by eye, because that's close enough. And as I think I mentioned, you're going to be amazed at how silky smooth this gets with that 30-minute rest. I mean, it really does feel amazingly good. And it's at moments like this I get sad for people that don't cook, because they will never feel this. But anyway, we'll divide that up. And then once that's set, what we'll do is take each of these pieces and roll them out until they're about the thickness of your thumb. Unless you have super small thumbs, which in that case simply roll it out to whatever you think a normal thumb thickness is. And then each of these we'll divide into 6. Just get them close, that's all we ask. At which point we can finally start forming our pot stickers. So what we'll do first is take one of these pieces and roll it into a ball, and then sort of flatten it out into a disc. And then I'm going to roll that out to about 3.5 inches wide using the totally wrong rolling pin. Okay, this is much harder with a big rolling pin like this. What they really use is more like a thick wooden dowel. Okay, about the thickness of a broomstick. In fact, that's how you could make one, by just simply cutting the handle off a broom, if you're not married. But the good news is it will still work, as long as you can still roll it out nice and thin, to, like I said, approximately 3.5 inches wide. And by the way, it does not have to be perfectly round. It just has to be round-ish. And then once that's set, we'll take our finger and dip it in a little bit of water and go around and moisten about the outside ½ inch. But not too much. We don't want it wet. We just want it sticky. And then once that's done, we can place down in the center a perfect portion of our meat. And I like a scoop because it's so much easier. And then what follows is my very unprofessional, yet highly effective way to seal these. What I like to do is press it together in the center, and then pick it up like this. And then with my right hand, I'm simultaneously pinching and pressing into the other side. And don't worry, I'm going to show you this a few times. Plus, you can actually rewind on YouTube now. But basically, we're just pinching a little bit of dough together, and then pressing it into the other side to seal it. And what that'll create is a set of pleats on one side, without any pleats or folds on the other. And once we get that sealed, we can always go back and do some fine-tuning, keeping in mind that no matter how bad you think these look, they always look amazing once they're cooked. So try to relax. And then once I've done that along the length, I'll make sure the bottom's nice and flat. And then with the pleated side away from me, we'll sort of bend each end back towards us to make a little bit of a curve, which not only looks cool, but it'll help them keep upright in the pan. And that's it. Let's try it again. So once we moisten in meat, we'll pick it up and press the center together, and then proceed with the old pinch, press, and pleat. And I fully admit I'm pretty terrible at doing this, but I really don't care, because like I said, they always still come out looking really nice. Having said that, I do encourage you to check out some videos and watch some pros doing this, because it's pretty impressive. But if you only do these once or twice a year like me, this may be about as good as it gets, which is absolutely fine. And by the way, if you're just not into any kind of special shaping or pleating, just simply press them together like a turnover with no pleating, and the rest of the procedure will still work. And what we'll want to do as we're making these is transfer them onto a well-floured plate. And I'm going to go ahead and stop at 7, because I want to show you the rest of this technique, and I'm starving. And yes, of course you can do these ahead. But anyway, that's the shaping phase, and we're now ready to proceed to the cooking and eating. And very ironically, I'll be cooking my potstickers in a nonstick pan, into which we're going to drizzle a couple tablespoons of oil, and place that over medium-high heat. And by the way, make sure you have a lid to cover these very close. And then what we'll do once our oil is hot is place these in flat side down, fancy side up, and we'll cook them for approximately 2 minutes or until the bottoms are golden brown. And we'll test by taking a look at them, which is one of the advantages of the nonstick pan. In the traditional method, these are literally stuck to the bottom until we add the liquid. So like I said, we'll let these go for a couple minutes until the bottoms are golden brown, which mine were right here. And then what we're going to do is drizzle in a couple tablespoons of water and quickly cover these. And we will let them steam for about 3 minutes. And I said steam, not boil, which is why we only want a little bit of water. And then what we'll do after 3 minutes is uncover them, turn our heat down to medium, and continue cooking for another couple minutes until all the water's gone and the bottoms are absolutely gorgeously golden brown and crispy and crunchy and looking amazing, which I think these do. And that's it. Once we've completed the fry, steam, fry method, we'll go ahead and transfer those to a plate. Of course, with that gorgeous fried surface showing. I mean, what kind of crazy person would plate this that side down? And then once arranged, we need to add a little ramekin for our sauce, as well as maybe a few green onions for a little bit of color. Oh, and by the way, the recipe for the dipping sauce I'll give you on the blog, but it's simply equal parts rice vinegar and soy sauce. And that's it. We just made homemade potstickers. And not only did these look great, they sounded great too. Oh yeah, that's the stuff. So let me go ahead and dip one in and go in for a taste. And man, were these good. That combination of textures between the crispy, crunchy side and those softer, tender sides is so interesting and so addictive and so amazing. And while very simple, that pork and cabbage filling is so flavorful and juicy. So even though I'm not that proficient at making these, I'm always absolutely thrilled with how they come out. And if you're thinking, that's too much work, isn't it easier just to get these from the takeout place? No, it's not. I ran the numbers. This is easier. If you factor in pleasure and satisfaction, which I did. And by the way, you can use this exact same technique for any kind of filling. Okay, imagine a cheeseburger pot sticker, or a Philly cheesesteak pot sticker, or a 5-alarm chili pot sticker, or, well, you get the idea. But regardless, whether you use the traditional filling or not, I really do hope you give these a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with lazy pork dumplings. That's right, making the dough and filling for a dumpling is pretty fast and easy. But the thing that takes a little bit of time and effort is all the shaping and folding and crimping and pleating that goes into making a nice looking dumpling. Which is why I'm very excited to show you a method for making dumplings much faster and easier. And while these might not be as pretty, thanks to the amazing taste and texture, the last thing you're going to be thinking about while you're eating these is what they look like. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with our lazy dough, which is going to be made with nothing more than all-purpose flour, a big pinch of salt, and some warm water. And what I like to do first is give this a mix with a normally sized wooden spoon until it all comes together into a very, very sticky dough ball. Alright, very sticky, as in too sticky to knead. But that is intentional, because what we'll do when it looks like this is get rid of the spoon, and we'll go ahead and transfer in some more flour. At which point we'll switch to our hand and start kneading this, and we will keep kneading, adding more flour if necessary, until we have a soft and supple but not sticky dough. And the beauty of this method is that we're not going to get stuck with a too dry dough. Okay, it's always way easier to knead a little more flour in than try to add some water later. So we generally want to start with something that's too sticky, and then we can work in some more flour a few tablespoons at a time until it's perfect. And that's it. Once we have achieved a dough that's soft but not sticky, we'll go ahead and wrap that with plastic, and then we'll just let it rest out at room temp for about an hour. And yes, of course, if you're going to make this ahead, you can leave it in the fridge. No problem. And that's it. Once our lazy dough's done, we can move on to our lazy filling, which is going to start with some ground pork, to which we will add a whole bunch of crushed garlic, as well as some freshly grated ginger root, followed by a whole bunch of sliced green onions, as well as their little cousin, freshly sliced chives. And by the way, if you get sick a lot, try to eat more garlic and types of onions. They really are helpful. But anyway, we'll go ahead and season this up with some kosher salt, as well as a whole bunch of freshly ground black pepper. And then since I gave Cayenne the day off, we're going to go with some Korean chili flakes. And then we will finish up with a splash of soy sauce, as well as about a teaspoon of sesame oil. And that is going to be it for our filling. We'll simply take a couple forks and mix this until just combined. And as you may have heard me say before, the reason I like the forks is so we're not in here with our hot hands and fingers, which will actually warm up the fat and can make things a little bit tough if you overmix it. And that's it. Once our mixture's been properly forked, we'll go ahead and throw a piece of plastic over that and toss it in the fridge until we're ready to use it. And not just to give it time for those flavors to develop, but it's almost always the case that the colder ground meat is, the easier it is to work with. So we'll pop that in the icebox, as our grandparents used to say. And then the only other prep we can do would be to flavor our chicken broth if we're going to flavor it at all. But I definitely am, with some vinegar and a little bit of soy sauce, as well as a nice big pinch of those Korean chili flakes we used earlier. And technically this step is optional, since we can just use regular chicken broth or stock. But anyway, I'll get into all that later. And the point is here is you can put anything you want in this or nothing. I mean, you are after all the sloth of your lazy dumpling broth. But in case it matters, I really loved how this came out. And then if we want, we can use this right away. But if we're going to make them later, just go ahead and pop that in the fridge as well. And that's it. Assuming we are ready to roll, we'll go ahead and pull out our dough. And I'm going to take about 1/4 of what we made. And on a floured surface, I'm going to kind of roll that out until it's about the thickness of my thumb. At which point we can switch to a rolling pin. And somehow, some way, using just enough flour so it doesn't stick, we'll want to roll this out into a band about 3 inches wide, by however long that is. Okay, let's say like 15, 16 inches. And then one kind of semi-important thing here. Once we have that about the size we want, we should go ahead and dust the surface with flour and then flip it over, so that we're pretty sure the surface underneath is not going to stick once we shape these. Plus now the side that's probably a little stickier is facing up, which is going to be an advantage when we move to the next step. But to hedge our bets, after we do a little bit of fine tuning, we'll go ahead and take some nice fresh cold water, plus 1 clean fingertip, and we'll go ahead and very lightly moisten the surface. And we don't want to put too much on. Right, we don't want it wet, we just want it a little bit sticky. And then once that's been accomplished, using the exact same water, we will moisten our fingers, and then use them to transfer on some filling right down the middle of our dough. And as you may know, wet fingers and hands do not stick to meat. So a little bit of moisture on them is going to make this a lot easier. And then once we've transferred the meat on, and evened it out again to about the thickness of our thumb, we will go ahead and fold that dough over along the whole length. And as we do, we'll be sure to press it down. which because our dough's kind of sticky should seal fairly easily. And the whole strategy behind this lazy dumpling method is that instead of forming and shaping and crimping and pleating 16 individual dumplings, we're basically just going to make one really long one and then divide that up into 16 pieces. Which again, while not as aesthetically pleasing maybe, is way, way faster and easier. And then what we can do once that's been completed, if we want, is take our bench scraper, or maybe a pizza wheel, and go ahead and trim off any of the excess. Which, by the way, if you don't mind a little extra dough in your dumpling, is a totally unnecessary step. But personally, I just like the minimum amount of dough needed to hold in all the meat. And then what we'll do before we divide these is dust on a little more flour, and then roll the entire thing so the seam's on the bottom. And that's it. Once that's set, this giant long dumpling is ready to be divided into lots of little ones, which I'm going to do with the well-floured side of my hand, which I will be pressing down very firmly all the way to the table. And for whatever reason, I started by dividing this into 2, and then into 4, and then into 8, and eventually 16. Although in hindsight, it probably would have been even better to start at one end, and then simply karate chop these all the way to the other end. But anyway, I have no regrets. Especially since, as you could probably notice, I was not overly concerned with getting all these perfectly even. And truth be told, once these are cooked, a little variation in size is not going to be very noticeable at all. So I simply embraced their diversity, and I continued on to the last step, which would be to cut these apart with a bench scraper or pizza cutter or knife, or a spatula, or whatever tool you'll think will get this done. And by the way, do not worry if your dough does not seal on the edges. That's totally fine. Okay, so please don't worry about trying to pinch the dough on the ends together. It will not be a problem. And that's it. I went ahead and transferred those onto a plate, at which point we can pop those in the fridge until we're ready to cook them. But I'm actually going to go ahead and cook up a serving now. And what I'm going to do is place those seam side up in a little bit of oil in a pan over high heat. And while you can just steam these or cook these in boiling water or broth, I think by browning and caramelizing them a little bit in the oil first, we get a much more interesting texture and flavor. Okay, so we're sort of borrowing from the old potsticker method here. So I gave that first side about a minute or two, and went ahead and flipped them over, at which point it's time to pour in our flavored and or non-flavored chicken broth. And then once that's been transferred in, we will cover this and let it boil on high for about 3 minutes or so, or until these are cooked through. Okay, that's really going to depend on how big you made yours. So if yours are bigger and you have to give them an extra minute, go ahead. That is just you cooking. But anyway, mine were done in about 3 minutes. And considering how fast and lazily and ununiform I made them, I thought they looked really good. So I went ahead and pulled those off and transferred them into a shallow bowl, along with, of course, my flavored broth. And by the way, when you do this at home, just go ahead and pour in all the broth. Okay, because I was going to take some pictures, I wanted the perfect level. So I held back about 3 tablespoons, which I have to admit is pretty frustrating to look at. So you go ahead and dump all yours in. And then I went ahead and finished mine up with a little more chili flake and a little scattering of those green onion tops I cut on the bias. And that's it. My lazy pork dumplings were done. So I grabbed a spoon and went in for a taste. And even though these are made with a completely different method, the final result was an eating experience very similar to a classic soup dumpling, which if you're not familiar is a gorgeous pork dumpling that actually contains meat and gelatinized broth inside, so that when you steam them, it liquefies. And when you take a bite, not only do you get the meat, but you get all that luscious broth exploding in your mouth. And since those are usually served with a little bit of soy and vinegar, as I was taking spoonfuls of this, it really was a remarkably similar thing. Plus, these are a little bit safer, because you can really severely burn your mouth with a soup dumpling, as every single person who's ever eaten them will tell you. So I didn't really set out to make a shortcut version of a soup dumpling, but somehow, someway, I accidentally ended up with that. And even though a soup dumpling is not fried first, because the broth inside of those is so much richer and meatier, I actually think that the caramelization here on the dough sort of kind of helped me get that effect. So above and beyond this being an easier, less fastidious method, it really did remind me of eating one of the world's most incredible, and by the way, hardest to make dumplings. But anyway, that's it, what I'm calling lazy pork dumplings. What these things lack in visual beauty, in gorgeous folds and pleats, they more than make up for by tasting exactly the same. Which is why I really do hope you give them a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with steamed barbecue pork buns. That's right, believe it or not, this is what they come out looking like if you don't know what you're doing, which is surprisingly similar to what they'd look like if you did. So yes, my love for steamed pork buns far exceeds my skills in making them, but that's basically the point I'm making. As inexperienced as I am, and as questionable as my techniques are, I still achieve some fairly beautiful buns. Or bao as our Chinese friends would call them. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with what is a very, very simple dough. And as usual, that'll begin with some warm but not too hot water, into which I'm going to sprinkle some dry active yeast. And then what we usually like to do is let our yeast get about a 10-minute head start before we add the rest of the ingredients. Plus, it also gives us a chance to check to make sure our yeast is not dead, which I'm happy to report mine wasn't. And then what we'll do after about 10 minutes is go ahead and add the rest of the ingredients, including a little bit of vegetable oil, a little touch of white sugar, and a whole bunch of self-rising flour, which as you may know is nothing more than regular flour that has salt and baking powder milled into it. And as usual, if you do want to use all-purpose flour, I will tell you how to make it into self-rising flour in the blog post. And then what we'll do is grab a wooden spoon and give this a mix until it comes together to form a shaggy dough. Oh yeah, you heard me, a shaggy dough, which is just like a regular dough, except much, much shaggier. And basically looks something like this, which does not look good yet. But that's fine, because what we'll do once it gets to this stage is go ahead and transfer it onto our work surface, and we'll sort of push and press and squeeze it together until it finally comes together into a ball, at which point we're going to knead it until it's nice and smooth. And as you know, if it seems a little bit wet, just sprinkle over a little more flour. And if it seems a little dry, you could add a little bit of water, but it's much, much harder adding water than adding flour. Which is why we always try to err on the side of having a little too wet of a dough than too dry of a dough. Speaking of which, unlike most of our pizza dough and bread dough recipes, this one is not going to be very sticky. Okay, we still want it soft and smooth, but we don't want this too wet and sticky. So I basically kneaded mine for about 10 minutes or so, until I ended up with something that looked and felt like this, which felt really good. And what we'll do once our dough's kneaded is transfer it into a lightly oiled bowl, and we'll flip that around to lightly coat it. At which point we're going to cover this and let it rise in a warm spot for about 2 hours or until doubled. And while we're waiting for that, we can do a couple things. For example, make our barbecued pork filling. And while I didn't happen to have any Chinese barbecue pork on hand, I did have a few leftover ribs and some pulled pork, which I'm simply going to remove from the bone and go ahead and chop up. And for these buns, I wanted to keep my streak going of never having used the same filling twice. And I'll also go into this in the blog post and give you some links to some real filling recipes. But this is what I went with this time, and it really is a great technique to use up some leftover meat. So I went ahead and chopped that up and added it to a bowl, along with some fairly finely sliced green onions, also known as scallions. And then the only other things I'm putting in this very simple filling would be some cayenne pepper, some sesame oil, and enough hoisin to make this as saucy as you want. And you'll sometimes hear people refer to hoisin as Chinese barbecue sauce, which I'm not sure is that accurate. But it does have some similar elements, including some sweetness. But I should mention that the traditional filling for these things is quite a bit sweeter, at least the ones I've had in San Francisco. So at least this time I'm doing more of a savory approach. But anyway, we'll go ahead and mix that up. And once it's looking and tasting just like we want, we'll go ahead and transfer that into the fridge and move on to set up our bamboo steamer, or other steamer of your choice. And first up, we're going to have to add a couple inches of water to whatever pot we're going to set our steamer over, which in my case is a Dutch oven, but you can also use a skillet or a frying pan. And if you don't have a steamer, there are tons of hacks online to show you how to steam without one. But these things are relatively inexpensive and easy to find, and I do recommend picking one up, especially if you get addicted to these. But anyway, once that's set up, we'll go back and check our dough, which hopefully by now is doubled in size, which means we'll give it the old poka to deflate it, and we'll proceed to transfer that onto a lightly floured surface, where I'm going to press it down before dividing it into 2 pieces. And I'm actually going to save half for a wild and crazy experiment. Well, actually not that crazy. I just wanted to see how the dough would steam the next day. And then with the half I'm using, I'm going to kind of roll that up into a tube-like shape so that eventually and hopefully I can cut 6 relatively even pieces. And of course, as I finished, I realized just cutting that flat piece of dough would probably have been easier. But on the other hand, this dough does feel really good. But anyway, somehow, someway, we'll divide that dough into 6 equal pieces. And then we'll take each piece and sort of rub it against the surface to form it back into a ball. And then eventually press it out into a disc. And then once that's set, we will roll each disc out to about 1/8 of an inch thick, and maybe about 4 to 5 inches in diameter. And then one of the few tips I know about making these is once that's rolled out, you want to go around the outside, pressing that edge a little bit thinner than the center, which you can do very awkwardly with the rolling pin like I am. And by the way, traditionally they use a much thinner rolling pin. It's more like a wooden dowel. Or if you want, you can just go around with your fingers, pressing and stretching. And then what we'll do once that's set is transfer in a spoonful of our filling, and try to be careful not to touch it with your fingers, otherwise you're going to stain your dough. And then to close these, there's a great technique for forming little pleats all the way around, which I've never mastered. Well, I'll try at the beginning, but then I quickly give up and just start randomly pinching and pleating it anywhere. And by the way, I think one little issue I had here was the dough was a little bit dry. So if you need to, don't be afraid to moisten the edge of that dough with a little bit of water. And then once I was done pinching and pleating, I went around trying to get those all folding over in the same direction, which was only moderately successful. And right about here is when I generally forget about technique and just sort of squeeze and pinch and twist everything so it seals at the top. And yet, as horribly unprofessional as that pleating is, as you'll see, once these are steamed, it actually looks pretty good. So please try to relax, because you really only need to do it as bad as I did. And then once formed, we'll go ahead and transfer these onto a little square of parchment paper we've cut out. And that's just so they don't stick to the steamer. And theoretically, as you do these, each one will get a little better. Although not for me. My second one looked pretty much exactly the same. But hey, at least I got sauce on the dough. And then what we'll do once these are prepped is go ahead and transfer them into our cold steamer. All right, don't turn it on yet. Because what we're going to do is cover these and proof them for about a half hour to 45 minutes before we do the actual steaming step. And roughly 35 minutes later, mine looked a little something like this. And while these probably won't double in size, they should puff up noticeably. Oh, and I should mention I can fit 6 in here, but I'm just doing 3, since it's always way easier to film fewer things. And then what we'll do to finish these off is go ahead and cover them back up, and we'll turn our heat on high. And we're going to steam these for exactly 10 minutes, but we do not start the timer until we can hear our water boiling, and we can see steam coming out through the top. And then once that happens, we'll go ahead and set our timer for 10 minutes, and do not under any circumstances peak. And not only don't we get to peak while it's steaming, we don't even get to peak after they're steamed. Because what we're going to do as soon as our timer rings is turn off the heat and then do absolutely nothing for 15 minutes. All right, do not under any circumstances take off the lid. And the reason is that rapid change in temperature will cause our dough to collapse. And instead of getting a beautiful, smooth, glossy surface, they will actually form all kinds of dimples and dents and not look as good. So somehow, some way, we will wait 15 minutes, at which point we can uncover them, so that we may gaze upon the aforementioned beautiful, perfectly smooth surface. And come on, I don't want to brag, but by looking at these, you would have no idea I had no idea what I was doing. So again, please don't stress out too much when you're forming these. As long as that dough at the top gets pinched together somehow, these are going to look great. And I should mention, if you're wondering why these aren't snowy white, like the ones from the takeout place, that's because to achieve that, you have to use a very special Chinese dumpling flour, which I've never bothered buying. But if you did want these to be snowy white, you could go out and find some. All right, that's up to you. I mean, you guys are, after all, the Chairman Maos of your barbecued pork bows. But personally, I don't mind the off-white. I'm kind of off-white. But anyway, the point is they look fine. So let me go ahead and grab one and pull off the paper, so I can bite in to make sure they taste fine. And fine they did taste. Okay, my filling was good. Not great, but good. I felt like I needed more sauce, and possibly a little more sweetness. But anyway, the filling's going to be up to you. The real video here is for the technique and the dough, which was absolutely perfect. Well, not the technique, but the dough. Okay, it was nice and soft and tender, so I really was thrilled with the texture of that. And I tend to use a pretty thin layer of the dough. Right, the quote-unquote authentic ones I get here in San Francisco probably have about twice as thick a layer of dough, so it is a little more bready with a little less filling. But anyway, that's it. My take on steamed barbecued pork buns. Like I said, I'll share a few links in the post in case you want to make the real filling. But if you do happen to have some leftover grilled or barbecued meat, this really was a delicious and pretty fun way to use it up, which is why I really do hope you give this a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Spätzle, or as we Americans prefer to pronounce it, Spaetzle. That's right, I'm going to show you how to make the world's smallest dumplings. And while technically that's what they are, I prefer to think of these as the world's easiest freeform pasta, since the taste and texture are very similar, and they will pretty much work with any of your favorite pasta preparations. Plus, above and beyond all that, this stuff is way faster and easier to make than pasta, as you're about to see. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with our Spätzle batter, which is made with some all-purpose flour, to which we will add 1 large egg. Of course, we'll also need some salt, which we always do, as well as, for me, a little pinch of cayenne, which I'm assuming is rarely added in Germany. But hey, their loss. And then we'll go ahead and finish this up with a spoon of creme fraiche, or sour cream, or yogurt. And then last but not least, a nice splash of whole milk. And believe it or not, that's it. And once all that's together, we will take a whisk and mix this smooth. And then evaluate for consistency. Okay, because what we're looking for is a batter that sort of drips slowly off the whisk, and not really run off the whisk. Okay, we don't want this too liquidy. So we will give it a mix and check it out. And you see how that's kind of pouring off quickly? Okay, so I think this is a little too thin. And to adjust that, we will simply add a little bit of flour. And conversely, if it's too thick, you'll add a little bit of milk. But anyway, we're going to stir in some more flour and check it out again. And now, as you can hopefully see, it's still dripping off the whisk, but much slower. Okay, so for me, that's looking very good. And then once we've adjusted the texture until we think it's just right, let's go ahead and clean off that whisk with a spatula. And I'll go ahead and give you one more look at the viscosity we're shooting for. Okay, so forget the exact measurements. You're going to have to adjust until you have something that looks like this. And then once the batter's set, we're going to need some kind of Spaetzle making tool with which to push our batter through into our boiling water. And while you could buy something specifically designed for this, you don't need to, because you probably already have one of these. Your standard cheese grater works perfectly for this operation. As long as the holes are at least this big, it's going to work great. And by the way, we're not going to use the side that grates the cheese. We're going to use the other side, also known as the smooth side. And how this works is we simply take some of our batter and transfer that onto our grater. And then we'll use our spatula to push it through, which again is why we want to make sure we're using the smooth side. Okay, nobody wants grated rubber in their Spaetzle. And that is it. A pretty simple technique. Except, of course, we're not going to do it back into the bowl. We're going to do that into some boiling salted water. But before we do that, let's do this. We want to first prep whatever sauce or substance our finished Spaetzle are going to go into. And my personal favorite, and very classic choice, would be some toasted butter. So what we'll do is melt some butter over medium heat and simply cook it, swirling occasionally, until that toasts to a nice golden brown. And yes, if you want to go darker, feel free. Or if you don't want it toasted and just want to melt the butter, that also works great. Okay, so how you finish this is going to be up to you. You are, after all, the Hansel and Gretel of your Spaetzle. But anyway, you can see how far I toasted mine. And once that's set, assuming we've brought some salted water to a boil, we are ready to extrude our batter. So what we'll do is place our batter on top of our grater, a couple spoonfuls at a time. Oh, and by the way, one way you can tell your texture was perfect, the batter won't drip through until you push it with the spatula. Okay, there's a very old German saying that I just made up. If it drips before you push, add some flour so you don't have mush. So not to brag, but this was looking just about perfect. And as you may notice, that's all sort of clumping together in one spot. And there's 2 reasons for that. One is I'm just looking at the viewfinder and not paying attention, because I should be moving that grater around more as I'm dropping it in. But also, I could have this boiling more furiously, but I didn't because it was fogging the lens. Having said that, it's not a problem, because when we take the strainer and give it a stir, those will all separate beautifully. Which reminds me, these are considered done when they float to the top, which, as you saw, happens very quickly. So this really is a super fast recipe. And then once those are floating, what we'll do is take a strainer and simply transfer those into our melted butter, or whatever sauce you happen to be using, and we'll repeat that very easy process until our batter's gone. And by the way, this was a very small batch I did, just using 1 egg. It's only enough for like 2 portions. But the good news is you can scale this up as much as you want. And if you are going to make larger quantities, you can totally do this step ahead, and then just reheat these in the sauce when you're ready to serve. So something to keep in mind. But anyway, we'll continue on until our batter's been used up, and all our Spaetzle has been transferred to our pan, At which point we have a few options. Since everything's hot, we could just toss this and serve it. But personally, I like to put the heat back on medium and give these a little bit of a saute for a minute or two. Okay, I don't really brown them, although some people do, and that is a very nice way to go. But I'm just going to cook these in that hot butter for about a minute or so, just to give them a little bit of time to absorb that beautiful nutty flavor. And of course, as always, we definitely want to give it a taste to see if it needs a little pinch of salt, which mine did. So I tossed them in and gave it one last stir, as well as one last taste. And once we're happy with it, we can turn off the heat, and then possibly finish with a little bit of fresh herb. I had some Italian parsley, so I'm using that. But some freshly snipped chives are also a wonderful choice. So I stirred that in, and that's it. Our Spätzle is ready to serve up. And yes, I'm pretty sure I've pronounced that differently every single time I've said it. I should have just stuck with Spaetzle, which, by the way, translates to little sparrows. So you could always go with that instead. But anyway, we'll spoon that up, and it's wonderful served as is. Or maybe with a little grating of cheese. Or even better yet, maybe make a little space in the middle and garnish this with a piece of cider braised pork shoulder. Oh yeah, that would be a great pairing. And I finished that up with a little extra creme fraiche and pinch of parsley. And normally at this point I would say stay tuned for the pork video. But you know what? I think we already did it. But I'll check. And if we don't, we'll do one. But anyway, let's forget about that luscious pork for a second. Let me go in for a taste so I can see how I did on my Spaetzle. And you know what? I did pretty darn good. They have a beautiful pasta-like flavor, which is amplified by our toasted butter. And the texture was just right. Okay, firm but not chewy. Tender but not soft. These really were spot on and uber delicious. And as you can imagine, just absolutely amazing with any kind of braised meat. And as you well know, we're heading right into braised meat season. So I was very happy with how this came out. I mean, I would make these even if they were hard and complicated, but they're not. As you saw, they're super easy and fast to make. So for all those reasons and more, I really do hope you give these a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Roman-style gnocchi. That's right, these don't look like gnocchi, which is okay because they don't taste like gnocchi either. But despite that, they are in fact a type of gnocchi, and an unbelievably delicious type at that. In fact, I'm going to make a bold prediction that once you see how easy these are to make, they will become your new favorite side dish. So despite the possibly confusing name, I mean personally I would have called them whatever the Italian word for hockey puck is. But anyway, possibly confusing names aside, I am very excited to show you these. And we'll go ahead and begin with the star of the show, semolina, which kind of sort of looks like a fine-grained cornmeal, but it's actually made from durum wheat, and is probably best known for its use in pasta making. But as you're hopefully about to find out, it works amazingly well in these. And the first step in this process is to basically make a semolina porridge. And for that, we're going to use some milk that we pour into a saucepan, to which we will add some salt. And what we're going to want to do is bring this up to a simmer on medium-high heat. But this is not actually ever going to get to a real simmer, because what we're going to do as soon as bubbles just start to break the surface is go ahead and whisk in our semolina. And we probably don't want to just dump it all in. We will add it in a steady stream as shown. And fair warning, this is going to thicken up very quickly, especially since I use a little more semolina than most recipes. But anyway, we're going to whisk that in. And like I said, it's going to thicken up really quickly. In fact, check this out. As I was stirring, I decided to change the camera angle for no apparent reason. So I stopped and it went from this to this in literally 5 seconds. Which is fine. That's what we want. Because what we're going to do at this point is switch to a wooden spoon and turn our heat down to medium-low. And then what we'll do once our heat's lowered and we switch to a nice sturdy spoon is simply cook that stirring on medium-low for about 7 to 10 minutes. And I say 7 to 10 because virtually every recipe says 10 minutes. And yet I usually get tired of stirring around 7 minutes and stop, and it always works. So I guess we'll make that the range. And by the way, if you happen to be thinking, I would have just started with a wooden spoon. Well, you know what? That's a good thought, and an even better idea. But anyway, I never seem to remember to do that. And I always end up starting with the whisk and switching to the spoon. But regardless, like I said, once we're on medium-low, we will simply cook that for about 7 to 10 minutes, at which point if everything's gone according to plan, your semolina porridge should look something like this. And what we'll do once that's been accomplished is remove that from the heat and stir in the rest of the ingredients, which will include some cubed up cold butter, a whole bunch of freshly grated Parmesan cheese, and 2 egg yolks. And because that mixture is very hot, and we don't want scrambled egg yolks, we'll go ahead and stir that vigorously until everything's combined. And I should mention, a lot of recipes actually have you add the butter to the milk, but I think you get a better texture if you add it with the cheese and the yolks. But the one drawback, because that butter's sort of melting as you're mixing, is that it can make this a little trickier to combine. And at certain points it might look like it's separating, but don't worry, just like some of those cookie dough recipes we've done. Just keep mixing and eventually it will all come together beautifully. And if not and it kind of looks separated, just switch back to the whisk. And you really shouldn't have a problem. And then what we'll do as soon as that's been successfully combined is switch to a spatula and clean off that spoon before transferring that into a prepared pan. And by prepared, I just mean lined with some plastic wrap. And in case you're keeping score at home, that is your standard quarter sheet pan. So we'll go ahead and transfer that in and spread it out nice and evenly. But don't worry about getting the top perfectly smooth, because what we're going to do is take another piece of plastic wrap and place that over the top and sort of gently press it down and smooth it out. And that is pretty much it for the first phase of Roman-style gnocchi. Because all we have left to do is chill this until it's firm enough to cut, which I'm going to do in the fridge because it's faster. So I'm going to go ahead and pop that in the fridge for about a half hour or so. And while we're waiting for that to firm up, we can go ahead and butter our baking dish. And today I'm going to be using this beautiful round French-style gratin dish, but any kind of casserole dish will work. So we'll go ahead and brush the bottom of that with butter. And then fast forward about a half hour later, at which point, as you'll see, our semolina porridge has firmed up nicely. So let's go ahead and unwrap that, as it is now officially ready to cut, which I like to do with a round biscuit cutter, because I enjoy what I'm told is the traditional circular shape. But if you do want to save a little time, you can just cut these in squares. These are really going to cook the same no matter what shape you make. But like I said, I do prefer the classic round. And I should mention, as you're doing these, do not discard the trimmings. Oh, we're going to use those in a second, as you'll see. So we'll go ahead and cut out our gnocchi and transfer those into our dish. And as you can see, I'm going to overlap those slightly. And then what we'll do once those are placed in is gather together all our trimmings. And then we'll simply wet our fingers and palms. And as you'll see, almost as if by magic, we're going to be able to smush all those scraps together. Ah, damp hands. Is there nothing they can't do? So as you can see, with a little bit of water on your hands, you should be able to press all those trimmings together, at which point we can flatten that out between 2 pieces of plastic, and we should be able to cut out 3 or 4 more. And while these certainly aren't going to be as perfect as the first batch, it still works perfectly fine, and once these are baked, they're going to look awesome. So we'll go ahead and make a few extra from those scraps and place those in, at which point we're going to top these with a generous amount of melted butter. Maybe even a very generous amount. So we'll go ahead and drizzle that over and brush that on. And then once that's been applied, we'll go ahead and finish this off with a little dusting of cayenne. No, your Roman friend is right. That is not traditional. But we usually don't let that stop us. And then last but not least, we will finish this off with some more freshly grated Parmesan. And not just any Parmesan. We definitely need to go with the Parmigiano Reggiano. And once that surface has been covered, as well as select parts of our kitchen towel, we are ready to bake. So let's go ahead and transfer that into the center of a 425-degree oven for about 25 minutes or until beautifully browned and basically looking like one of the greatest things you've ever seen come out of an oven. I mean, come on, look at that. And you might be wondering, those edges look crispy, but are they? Well, let's grab a fork and listen. Even over the sound of my oven fan, you could hear how crispy that is. Which for me is exactly why Roman-style gnocchi is so awesome. You get this incredible combination of that crispy, buttery outside, encasing that creamy, custardy inside. It's just unreal. And in addition to looking great, feeling great, and tasting great, this stuff's also amazingly versatile. Yes, of course it can be served as a side dish with some meatballs and maybe a salad. But it's equally spectacular as a first course, or a pasta course, or maybe even throw a wild mushroom sauce over this and do it as a main course. So many options. But of course that's up to you. You are the King George of your savory baked porridge. But this time I did go with it as a side dish for meatballs, which by the way were not very good. I didn't have time to make homemade and tried some from a new market down the street, and they weren't great. But I wasn't even mad, because these amazing gnocchi alla romana provided more than enough pleasure for the whole plate. It is just insanely good. But anyway, that's it, Roman-style gnocchi. Like I said in the intro, the name might throw you off a little bit, but give them a try anyway, because I really do think these are going to become one of your favorite side dishes, or main courses, or pasta courses. Well, you get the idea. So I really do hope you give these a try soon. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.